So we're going to talk about Group Writeback. So this is something we recently announced on a public preview. So we're actually going to walk through the documentation, the features, and I'm actually probably not going to configure Azure AD Connect because I think that's already out there. But I think there's some questions around how do you manage the groups that you actually want to write back. So that's what today is going to be. I actually wrote the PowerShell for this already, and we're going to publish it in the MS Identity tools. But I thought it was a good experience of like why we needed it, what we can do in MS Graph, and how we can build commandlets off of the MS Graph using the PowerShell SDK. So I thought it was a good example. Let's look at what we're going to do here. So I luckily did some homework and I went and grabbed the docs that we're going to be doing. So with the new writeback, we have V2. Now V1 has been around for a while. It allowed you to take M365 groups and say, when you enabled it, I want all the groups, all the M365 groups to be written back on-prem. And many customers who had enabled this, they really wanted to take them and write them back as different group types. So on-prem AD, you've got different kind of groups, security, distribution, universal, global, all the different legacy combinations we know and love. But customers really wanted to say, take the M365 group, write it back on-prem and have some control. But they also wanted to take security groups and write them on-prem, right? Because we want to be able to get to the point where we no longer have to manage on-prem for on-prem and then sync it up to the cloud to consume it. We actually want to manage it from the cloud centrally and then write back where we're using it, right? So we're using cloud resources in Azure AD and all the apps that we have connected to Azure AD. But now we want to take those groups and then bring them on-prem and consume them on-prem. So that's what V2 allows us to do. It allows us to say, for these groups that I want to write back, I want to write them back the specific group type. And if it's a security group, write it back as a security group. So if you look at the documentation, this is the original Azure AD Group Writeback capability here. So if you enable this, it will take all the M365 groups as distribution groups. This is very key and maybe a point of confusion as we go into V2. And then we enable V2. And V2 is just a feature flag on the Azure AD Connect. So we walk through all the different steps here. And this is basically the Azure AD Connect wizard. And again, I'm not really so focused on that because it's pretty straightforward. But maybe what isn't as straightforward is managing the groups that you actually want to write back. So I'm going to assume that this is set up in an environment, or maybe it's not set up yet. And there's an important step I want to call here. I think you should be looking at the groups that you want to write back, configuring them for the ones you want to write back before you initially configure it, right? So this way you know what groups that you want it to do. Still right? Well, if you, the GUID name, so if you actually enable the feature recently in the newer versions, you actually can enable the display name. So that is an option you can do. All right, and then we talk about some of the, write back and so forth. So let's look at my environment. So this is the documentation. We know the feature, but let's look at actually how we create these groups and how we're managing them. So I just have a simple Windows 11 machine here. I think this actually is an insider build. But anyway, it is a Windows 11, some basic configuration, right? It's Azure AD when join. I have a user. I've installed PowerShell, Python, Visual Studio Code. These are tools that I use almost every day. I mean, in my role, I'm not a coder, but I can write things when I need, right? So I do tend to use them. So we're going to look at utilizing the portal for configuring these groups using Graph API and then creating a PowerShell commandlet to automate that. I don't think any large organization is going to go one by one in the portal to configure their groups. They're going to use some kind of bulk or automation. So we'll talk about how we can do that. All right. So let's go to the Azure AD portal. Now, we recently have the new name, the Entra portal. So we're going to start there. And this is the root of that. And in this case, I care about groups, right? So let's go look at all groups. Now, I can see these are all variety of groups. Now you'll notice I have some PIM groups here, right? And that's because in my environment, I am using entitlement management to actually assign the directory roles to my users. So I've actually previously set up, Well, look at here. I am not authorized. Well, why is that? Well, it's because I have not elevated. So I have actually set up all of my role assignments as role assignable groups, and I've enabled those through entitlement management. So in this case, because I am going to show EM, I am going to go and I'm going to actually elevate to global administrator. Yeah, this looks good. Activate there. Now, you're wondering if I'm not getting MFA prompts, and that's because this is set up with Windows for Business. So I'm always using strong authentication when I'm accessing these resources here. So I've already done that, and it's respecting those claims. And maybe we'll get to the point where I talk about B2B and how we can trust those, because I have multiple environments that I may want to manage the same way. So now that I've elevated, I now have global admin. So let's go back into entitlement management. And I can say here that I have, I set up this video roles, right? This is to create these videos, but essentially in here, I've created role assignable groups, and I've created a policy to request and assign those. And then I've assigned that to this test user. So this was all set up with the initial IGA admin. And then I've now delegated to this account that I'm using here. So I'm not using standing access, I'm using PIM. And now you know the roles that I'll be dealing with, right? So I'm going to be using global admin only because I went into entitlement management, but I could have just elevated to group admin for what we're going to be doing in this scenario. And I sort of set this up as a framework for future videos, but group admin is probably all I would need at this point. All right, so let's go back into groups. Let's go to all groups. And we're actually going to create a new group. Right, so we're going to create a security group. Let's call this S video 1, right? So I'm calling S for security, and this will make it easier for me later on as we go through these. So, and that's good, it's fine. We're going to leave that here. And then we're going to create another new group. We're going to create this as an M365 group, M video 1. All right, so now I've got a security group and a M365 group. And I'll probably will create some more as we go. So now that we've created these, let's go back and look at the default settings in the portal. Let's gotta wait a minute for them to appear. So SVD1, standard security group, Azure AD security group, right? We want to be able to create these in the cloud, use all the good governance capabilities that we have, and then be able to write them back on-prem so they could be consumed on-prem. So when I have a group that I've created as a cloud group, how do I mark it to go be created as a security group on-prem? Well, you'll see here that in the properties, we actually have this group writeback state. So security groups, by default, are created no write back. They are not written back unless you explicitly write them back. So we can look at this here, and I can set this to a security group. So this will tell Azure AD Connect that when this group is next synchronization cycle, that this group will now be imported from the Azure AD, put in the connector space, and then provisioned and created on-prem as a security group in the designated group creation OU. So we're going to save that here. And actually, let's go back, and I reminded myself I'm going to create a second one. So let's call it another one here. Video 2. Right, looks good. And then when we go to the Microsoft group here, and video 1, I've created the M65 group. And similar to this, it has properties. Now you'll notice it says no write back. But we did mention earlier that if you enable Group Writeback V1, all M365 groups are written back. So this will become an important thing later on as we go into the API. But let's say I want to create this as a, maybe I want to create this as a security group down here. So now I'm saying I do want to write it back, and I do want to create it as a security group. So let's do that. And then we're going to go back one more. I'm going to create that second M365 group, and we're going to look at how the defaults actually work there. Video 2. Yeah, looks good. Oh, I want to create that as M65. Thank you. All right, so two different group types, single way for managing the portal. But let's actually go and look at the API. So when I'm thinking about managing something in Azure AD, I want to understand what's possible. And I go to the Graph API for that, right? So graph.microsoft.io, what actually goes here now. But in our docs, we actually talk about the endpoints or the objects, right? So the entities that we're managing, let's go to the reference here. And I actually want to go to groups. So I think this is the right one. No, that's a reference. Here we go. So this gives me all of the API information that I need for managing this object type. Now, if you are an admin, this may, and not a developer, this can be very overwhelming, right? So this is a shade different than typically you may be used to doing managing groups on-prem. And there's a lot of capabilities here. And that's because a group is more than just assigning access in the Azure AD model or the M365 model. So there's a lot of properties, a lot of capabilities in here. But if I want to actually go and enumerate these, I could go to the Graph Explorer. So we can go to the Graph Explorer, the visual sort of tool for working with the Graph API. It's very common. If you're getting started with Graph API, very simple to start here, maybe graduate into other clients like Postman, but this is a very straightforward and easy way to understand working with the platform. So I'm actually connected because I did connect earlier. So now we're actually going to enumerate those groups that are in this tenant. And this is probably a lot of well-known information if you've come in here for PowerShell, and I will get to there. But we're just going over the basics of working with the API. So I authenticate to Azure AD by asking for a token for the MS Graph API. I exchange that token with the Graph API so that I can access the API. So that is the high level of the process. The tool that I'm using here is the Graph Explorer that's facilitating that. So now we're going to enumerate those groups. And we can see these are all the groups that came back in my tenant. Now I'm using the V1 endpoint. There's a beta and a V1. Right now I'm using V1. So let me see. So if I actually wanted to find those groups that I just created, so let's do display name equals M video 1, I think I called it. Yep. So M video 1. So there's a lot of properties on here. And let's see if I can scroll down in there. But I don't really see the attributes that I'm looking for because I want to switch to the beta endpoint. Now let's look at those. And I see writeback, right? So writeback is enabled for this this object, and it is going to write back as a security group. Now let's look at the other one. But this one is null. Now, why is that, right? So I set one, I didn't set the other, and that's because the default state is null, right? And because if you enable group writeback, it's going to write back all M365 groups. So group writeback V1 said take all. So when we have our existing M365 groups that we may have not thought about writing back, and we now want to do selective write back, I think we actually want to go in there and say which groups that we actually don't want to write back from M365, and then which security groups that we do want to write back. So we want to get to the point where we've are very clear on which ones we're writing back and what type that is. So how do I figure out what should I be doing with these values, right? So we talked about the setting up the feature, but let's actually go look at the configuration in the API docs here. So group writeback configuration. So this is the doc here, and those two properties is enabled. That's going to dictate whether group writeback is enabled, true or false, and then the different group types that it will write back as. So you can see here that the three types are these three here, and if you enable true, is enable true, but a null group type, there actually are some defaults that happen here. So we can see that this matches what those current settings are. If I were to look at an object, I can look at these to determine are they going to be written back or not. And if I want to set these, this will dictate how they write back to on-prem. All right, so pretty straightforward Graph API, but this is a process that typically when I look at, I want to do something different. Maybe I want to manage something in a new way. So now we're going to go to PowerShell, and PowerShell is kind of, I think it's the tool for every admin. I know there's the AZ commands out there. I'm partial to PowerShell. So, historically we have the Azure AD modules, the MSLN modules, and now with the MS Graph modules, I think that's really where IT admins should be focusing. And my whole point of doing this sort of event is to walk through creating and doing tasks as admins using the new module. So if you haven't installed the module before, it is going to be here. Microsoft Graph. And I can see the latest version is 1.10 here. Since I'm using Windows 11, this is the Windows admin terminal. I highly recommend it for any Windows user. It's 10. You can install it from the store, but it's really a great tool. And I always recommend using PowerShell 7.x, or whatever the latest 7. is. I don't use Windows PowerShell anymore. I know it's still out there, but there's so many benefits for 7. The tooling, whatever. So everything I write these days really is written for PowerShell 7, and because that's built on .NET Core, it does make it the more portable, right? So if you're a Mac user or a Linux user, you get all the benefits of using PowerShell versus Windows PowerShell. All right, so we've found the module. Now, typically, I would install the module, and I already have it, so I don't need to do that again. So actually, I think it will tell me it's installed. But if you haven't installed in a while, you just say update module. All right, so we are now in the PowerShell. So let me make that a little bit bigger. So we actually, first thing we want to do is we actually want to connect to MS Graph API, right? So let's do this. So I want to actually look at the base commandlets that are built into the module. Now, this module, I'm sure many know, is on GitHub. It is open source. So let's go. So this is the module, right? So when they publish a new version, this one's 25 days ago, it gets published to the PowerShell gallery, you can see here, and then all the normal installation for it. But one of the cool things is that all the logic for these modules are all readily available here. So we can go in here and look and see what's available for groups. And then are there sort of customizations that somebody may have done? You can see there are customizations that were added to groups. But really worthwhile exploring this repo, but right now we're going to use it. So coming back here, the core module is going to be Microsoft Graph Authentication. Now you can see these commandlets that are here: connect graph, connect, disconnect graph, invoke graph request. These are very core things. You'll use those a lot. Environments. If you're working cross cloud, whether you're working on maybe commercial or you're working on the US Gov or 21 ViaNet environments. And then we have things like getting the context, right? Things about the environment, the profile, and there's some great things here about finding commands and finding permissions. These really make it useful for the action you're trying to do, to understand what permissions you may need to request to actually do them. So right now, we're actually just going to connect to MS Graph, but let me just show you this command: connect mg graph. So this shows you all the kind of visual of a lot of the parameters that you have available for you. Now, if you really don't connect any parameters, it's actually going to prompt a window where you can authenticate using your Azure AD account, and then it'll connect to that tenant. But you have some other environments here. Maybe you want to connect to a specific tenant. This is very useful for B2B. So I'm authenticating with my local user to my local tenant, but I want to access an external environment that I'm B2B. Very common admin sort of pattern you have there. And then I can specify a client ID. So you may be using the public Microsoft Graph PowerShell client ID. I use a dedicated client ID. I have customers who use a dedicated client ID because they want to control the assignment of who actually can call the graph from PowerShell. You have a lot of options here to do that. But the key one here is scopes. We actually have to specify the permission scopes that I actually want to connect with. And this will be the context in which I create a request for a token for. And then you can use an access token if you've acquired one, you want to reuse it, maybe in automation. And then these parameter sets are if I was connecting as an app only principal. So for those maybe not as familiar, we have user authentication, so which is like user permissions, user doing something. And then you have app only, an application doing those tasks. The module supports both those. So if I'm doing interactive, like I'm doing today, we're going to be using user parameters or user permissions. But if I'm doing really automation, things that are non-interactive, I have a scheduled task, an Azure function, I'm going to be using a service principal. I'm using client credentials. All right, let's cancel that. All right, so now let's look at connecting. So we're actually going to connect MG Graph. Now, I actually have a common scopes variable. These are just the common scopes that I'm using in a lot of my demos. It just makes it easy for me. But typically you want to connect MG Graph with the scopes that you need. So in this case, I'm going to say group read write all. And I'm connected. Now, I didn't get prompted. I didn't get anything. What happened there? Well, it's because I've connected before. I have consented to this permissions in my environment, so I don't need to ask for consent. This is already set up. If I actually were to go into the tenant here, I actually can go to applications. Let's go here. And I can see Microsoft Graph Explorer is here, or PowerShell, I should say. So in here, I do recommend assignment required. I didn't have it in the lab, but I do recommend that. This way you know who's utilizing the application and you can manage who can use that. It's a nice thing you can do for controlling access, and probably the same thing for Graph Explorer. But each organization really has to decide on how they want to use those tools. But in here, I can see that this user was already, sorry, the permissions were already consented over here. So there were admin consented earlier from my testing. And that's because I've made that user consent isn't really enabled. They use the admin consent workflow to request it, and then admins actually have to consent to that. All right, so before I forget, because I just flipped that, let me just add this user before I figure out later why am I not getting tokens. All right, so we've connected. Let's look at the context. This is the client ID, which is like the public client ID. This is the tenant I've connected to. These are the scopes. Now, why does it have more scopes than what I actually specified? And that's because I actually had the PowerShell has like a caching capability. You actually can say -force refresh if you want to do a fresh authentication. And then there's context settings around user or process. There's a lot you can do with the module itself. But this key one here is it was a delegated permission type. If it was app, it would say app and so forth. All right, so let's look at some groups. So let's go look at those groups that we just created. Let's do this. These are my groups. So I got 25 groups. All right, so let's find the groups that I created. There. Found in PowerShell and OData are the different filter formats, but you kind of get used to them after a while. All right, so let's look at that. I don't see properties on this group. Now, that's because we'll find them under additional properties here. So we can see okay, I don't see the ones for this one. Now let's go look at the other one, and that's okay. Because I forgot to switch my profile. So the profile that I'm actually connected with is the 1.0. We're actually going to say select MG profile, name, beta. We're going to run that again. Oh, play S video. Oh, so I have since updated the command since I actually looked at this, and we now actually have the write-back configuration here, which is great. I spelled it right. So I'll try to select. So we can see the properties here. This actually makes it a lot easier for working with these properties. So I'm actually happy to see this. All right, so let's go and look at the M365 groups. Okay, that's the first one. And the second one. The second one's null. So what's going to happen here is that both these groups actually will get written back if I were to enable Group Writeback. And that's because the default state is that if it's null or true, we're going to write it back. So we actually want to go in there and update these groups to say, let's make sure that they are explicitly going to be written back as we want to. All right, so we could do that by taking this group and let's see if we can do that. I just get my sets and what do you call it? Because it's actually this. Now we actually want the group ID because this is what allows us to specify the group. Now, if you're used to on-prem groups with unique same account names, that doesn't really exist in the same way here. So let's actually get that group's group ID. And I was wondering why my autocomplete was not, and that's because I did not do that. All right, so let's do this. Okay, put that in my buffer. And now we're gonna say get mg group ID. And there's group. Now let's update that group. Now, do we have? We do. So this is probably going to take a hash table. So let's see. And there we go. So it makes it really simple to go in there and update the values. But maybe I want to change the here. So let's do type equals. I think this was one of the ones, right? Let's see. Yep. So with those two commands, we can easily go in there and update the groups, right? So by modifying the write-back configuration, we can do ones and two. But let's build something that makes it a little bit easier to do this, right? So if you're familiar with Graph API and MS Graph API, you kind of have to know these settings. So we're going to create a quick helper wrapper to make it a little bit easier. So maybe those who are not as familiar with the commandlets and the API to be able to facilitate this. So let's go build a commandlet. I know that sounds exciting. So we're going to do it in Visual Studio Code. Now, if you have not been using Visual Studio Code, highly recommend it. It's my my go-to for a variety of reasons. But this is just almost vanilla. I created a project earlier just to make sure I had everything installed. So let's actually go into here, and we're going to create a new folder. I'm going to call this Group Writeback. And just to make it easier for myself, I'm going to call it GWB. So what I'm doing is I'm scoping it's fine. The sort of the file structure to Visual Studio. So let's create a new folder down here, and Let's kind of call this script. So now let's create a new script. Say get, I don't know what prefix. Let's just call it AD Group Writeback config PS1. All right, so we're going to make a simple PowerShell script here, and I'm actually going to use the commandlets, right? So sorry, the snippets basically. So I can type the name here, and I can see that there's already a snippet here to kind of build that structure. Now, it's built into the Visual Studio, and that's because I actually have a lot of these plugins already here. So you can see, because I've added these in here, I get code snippets, right? I get highlighting, I get a lot of stuff here that really makes sense to me why you want to be using VS Code. Now, I know there's a lot of people who really like the ISE, but I could not go back. ISE was great, but I think the extensibility of VS Code really makes it for me. And when we get to debugging, that's really when it really shines for me. All right, so let's create a commandlet. And by doing that, it gives me the sort of the structure that I want. And because we actually need to use proper verbs, so we actually want to say what verbs are available, right? So if you didn't know, so one of the cool things of VS Code is it actually has PS Script Analyzer built into it. So as I'm going through running code, it actually is going to check for common errors. So if you've ever published something, you always want to use a PS Script Analyzer as common rules that can be applied. You can do custom ones too, but having that in VS Code, and if you're going to publish something to PowerShell Gallery, it will check it and let you know that things could be better. All right, so actually let's sort that again. What's it by name? Yeah, not name. Is that? Oh, verb. That makes total sense. So I'm going to use get, but you could say select. You could say, kind of whatever you think makes sense for the intent of the commandlet, right? Because I want to get the settings. Well, that's what we're going to do. All right, so we're going to use get, and that's the name. So the things that I actually want as far as a parameter, this is the input into the script itself, or the commandlet itself. So I actually want the group IDs, but I want to make this so that I can just pass in a collection and I don't have to, do it one by one. I can do a for loop outside of it, but I find it easier to include that in my scripts here. So we're just going to call that group ID. But there's some interesting things that we may want to do. I can check here certain bits about validation. So I can actually validate my input. I probably could add a validation script here to make sure that the GUID that I'm putting, or the ID that I'm specifying, is a GUID. I'm not going to do that here. When I'm going to publish something in the gallery, I'll go through and I'll walk through things like how could we, guide users of this logic better. So by using validations, we could definitely do that. And we'll use some of these later on with what I'm thinking. But one of the things that we're going to do here, so we have group ID. So in my script, I probably want to do some basic checking of, do I have the permissions that I need to actually call this, right? So typically, I'll put a check here to say, since I know we're going to be working with groups, maybe I want to check to see, do you have the proper scopes defined? Because we don't want to run a commandlet only to find out that it is an error. You have to go reconnect. I can start here so I don't have to throw a bunch of errors. And because I know I'm using the beta API or the beta endpoint, I actually want to make sure that I'm connecting with that beta endpoint before I start running commandlets. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to do a quick check for, are you connected, right? So if you're not connected to the Graph API, so I'm actually going to check the context, because if you're not connected, I'm going to not get a context. but by getting a context, then I know you are. So if you're not, I'm going to throw a hard error and we're going to stop and tell you that we really need you to go and connect first. And we'll test this too. And because I am using the beta endpoint, so I actually have a check to say, if you are connected, check the profile that you're connected to and make sure that it is the beta. So this is how I can help guide the user, because I know I wrote the code, what I'm trying to do, for common things that may prevent them from being successful. All right. So now let's actually enumerate the groups. So you'll notice that I made the type here an array of string, and that's because I want to be able to pass a collection in here. So we're going to say for each, I'm going to call this GID in group ID. So let's do that. So this is kind of like the main sort of processing. So for every group ID that I'm pasting or I want to process, we're going to run the same set of commandlets for each of those. Pretty clear. So the thing that we're going to do is I'm actually going to take the group ID and then query Graph API for that group object. So I'm actually going to write some verbose logic in here too. So if I want to give feedback to the person running, if they run with a verbose sort of switch, we'll give that. Otherwise, we're going to run silent, right? I don't need to emit a lot of noise if we don't need to. So I make that a verbose. And then as I'm going through this environment, I'm actually going to plan how I'm going to emit my results to the end user. So in this case, I'm actually going to create an object called check group here. And what we're actually going to start out with is an ordered hash table. So this allows me to go through my logic here and start creating properties on this hash table, and then finally be able to emit that as an object later on. So we're going to say check group, and I'm using order because I like the ordering of the properties I'm going to do here. So we're going to say, we're going to pick up a group, but we need to, I'm just going to set it to null because we're going to loop through these. And then we're actually going to go and query the Graph API for that group based on that ID. So let's do this, group ID, PID. So query Graph API for the group ID that I have in there. And then I'm going to add that as a property. Now, what should I do here, right? I could wrap this in something checking to see if I have an error, but in this case, I'm just going to do, I'm checking that I don't have null results, right? Because maybe the group ID, for some reason, is not there. So what we're going to say is if null not equal group, because remember, I set it above, and if we had an error or was not found, I expect that there will be no object coming back. So in this case, I have a group. So we're actually going to start decorating those properties. I'm going to give it the ID, group ID. And then I'm going to take the display name of that group. And I'm going to grab the group type, because the group type is going to dictate some things down below as we go through. So we're going to say, oops, group types equals or contains, because I know that M65 groups, because I've looked at the groups below here. So let's go back. So I can see the group types for M65 groups contains unified. So that's going to be my quick test to say, does this group contain that group type? Then I know it's an M65 group. And this is, so yeah, groups, and I'm going to do a operator here, ternary operator. So saying if it does, it's true. If it's false, it's a security group. Pick a type. So now I've grabbed the group type from the group, and then I'm going to add that to my group type. Group type. All right. And then we're going to say writeback enabled is null. And now I'm going to check, is it enabled on this object, right? So I can read back those properties on the group. So let's take a look at writeback. What was the actual property? Writeback configuration. Now, if that property was not there, I can grab it from the additional properties as well. But because it's a defined on the object, I'm going to grab that here. And I'm going to say is enabled. Oops, didn't want to do that one. Now, I think there might be an error here if it's null, so we'll have to account for that. But in this case, we're going to say if it's true, writeback enabled equals. Now I'm using a string here. You'll see why in a second, right? I could use a Boolean, but I'm actually going to have a third value, so I don't want to make it a Boolean. And that's because I'm sort of differentiating between true, false, or when it's null or not set. All right, we've done that. So now let's set that to our the type on here. And for right now, I think this is good, where it's going to check these and we'll come back and we're going to write back the object out on my output. So we're actually going to convert that to a PS custom object. So that's how I created the hash table earlier. We're going to write that back, checked group. All right, so it looks good. So really simple. Let's test it. Oops, didn't want that. I want terminal. So let's run this script. We're going to dot source it, put it in memory, get AAD, ask for a group ID, 1, 2, 3. Well, I'm not connected. So this was the error that we put in before. So I made a check to say, if you're not connected, we first wanted to run this. So I actually have a little helper that actually will connect me, and now I'm connected. Well, invalid object identifier, and that's because I didn't check the input. I think I mentioned earlier about I could check the GUID input, but in this case, I know it's not a GUID. I did it to show the error. So let's look at groups, and let's copy a group ID that we know is valid. And there we go. So we have this group ID. We check the group. We check the type. We check that it's not set. So right now, I could loop through all my groups with a simple command. True for each. Now the shortcut is %, but in a script, I probably would not want that. And PS script analyzer would yell at me saying that that is not appropriate. So in a script, or not explicit, I shouldn't say appropriate. So I know that I'm passing the object ID. Sorry, I'm passing the object, and the property I want is ID. So we could do that, and I can enumerate all my groups and see what the settings are. So notice they all say not set, but we know that's not the case, right? So why is that? Well, I think, what is my, I am beta. So how would we determine why are we not getting the writeback enabled that we expect here? So let's do some little debugging. So now, switch writeback enabled. There we go. So let's see what the values are. So let's debug that. Start debugging. And I can look in here and see what are these values in here. So writeback enabled is null, as I would expect. Group writeback configuration is enabled as null. So on this one, I would expect it to be not set. So let's go through and actually let's watch this. Not available. So I suspect maybe this on this one, it was null. Oh, there we go. So it was a combination of not getting the property and also had is enabled and is enabled. So easy mistake, but now we can see which groups that are written back. And this one is going to be written back. This one is going to be written back. And this one's going to be written back. And we could actually go back and expand this some more. And let's say, let's get the on-premises group writeback type. So let's do this. Premises type. Because we have a new property. There we go. So for anyone that is not set, there's nothing set, obviously, and anything that is set there. So now we have a simple commandlet to enumerate all my groups and decide if I want to actually set them. So now let's just go and make something easy to set. Writeback. Big. So same format here. This actually should be a little easier because we are just going to be updating some. We're going to build in some things that are make it easy. So I'm actually going to copy these. Goes in here. And I'm actually going to take this. But I actually need to specify other values. So I actually want a string on-premises group type. And because I know that I want to constrain these, I'm actually going to specify limit of values that we actually can utilize. So if we remember, we went to the docs here earlier, somewhere in here, only these three types are supported, right? So let's make sure that we can only set those three types. And this actually make it easier for somebody who's running the commandlet to not have to look at the docs and go find hopefully the help that I've added or somebody's added. I'm actually constraining the values that will be accepted on that commandlet. So we're validating that set on-premises group type here. And then we'll clean up some other things later on, but I think this is good enough for now. So we're making our check here. And the same way, we're going to do this. And setting group writeback settings for group ID. I forgot one. We actually want to say. So this is where I kind of can make a decision. Do I want a Boolean? Do I want to make it a true, like a Boolean true false or a switch? I'm going to go with a Boolean in this case. So it can only be true or false. So either it is enabled or it's not. So we're going to say is enabled. Okay, so we're going to set update. Okay, simple check here. So let's take that security group we had earlier. What did I mess up here? Yeah, good. I'm glad this is useful. Again, it's not oh, that's why. It's not meant to be highly structured, so is enabled. Oh, I got to do that. Now we can read that back again. Breakpoints. So it's false. Let's go set it to true. It's not true. So we can easily go back and forth, and now we can kind of bulk set these, right? So if I actually wanted to, I actually can go back and go to all my groups. And basically, I am getting those groups, but now we're actually going to update all of them to false. Now you'll notice I'm getting errors in some of these, and that's because some of the groups that I'm modifying, I don't think I have the rights because I think they are sync groups in my environment. So I typically would have gone through and filtered my groups before I set them up. But I was just showing an example here of how you can easily go in there, identify the groups you want to disable or the ones you want to do, and easily update them to sync back or not. But we can go even further and say, well, what kind of group do we want to create on-prem? So we have on here, group has been enabled. And I actually can go and say if not equal to on-premises group type. So basically, if we were setting that value, we're actually going to update those values too. On this group type. So now we load that again. And for my initial group, the one we had earlier, so we're going to update. We're actually going to say create as a distribution group. Now, what is the invalid values? Well, I suspect because this is a security group, they can only be written back as security groups. See? So if I were writing a script, I would capture this error because I know, according to the docs, security groups can't be written back as those. But if I was, do I have any? Let's get one. Group, filter. What is it? Group type contains unified group. I believe this should give me all of my, oh, I don't like that. Paper types. There we go. So for each of these, we're actually going to set and we're going to set them to mail nibble security groups. And so we now just updated all of our M365 groups to be written back on-prem as mail nibble security groups. And we'll just confirm them. And they are all universal mail nibble security groups. So we could, go back and forth. So you really can, simple automation. You can actually take a large organization and plan out how you're actually going to write back the groups before you enable that. So that way you know that when you've turned on the feature, you have all the correct groups that you want. All right, so this was simple. If I spent some time on this, I would clean this up. But typically when I'm working through sort of things that I think many customers would be able to benefit from, the team actually will publish identity tools. These sort of commandlets are helper commandlets in the identity tools module. And the one that actually I will check with the team this week is we'll add it. So this way customers can easily don't have to write their own, but you can utilize the ones that we put in here. So if you haven't seen this before, there is a whole wiki of commandlets that we have that do a lot of cool and awesome things. So I would highly check that out.